font licensing and logo design. It's a question every designer comes across as you are designing logos or brands for clients, is how do you handle font licensing with your clients as a designer? So I've got a lot of thoughts on this in a specific client situation that came into my inbox from a fellow designer that I'm going to dig in how I would navigate this. But first, let's start off with a recommended tool, which is if you go to sprucerd.com/0, you will run into our zero revision presentation method. This is a method that I've used for years with my studio that helps our studio get zero revisions with our clients from the very first proof. So if you are a designer working with brands or print design, web design, whatever it may be, this is a great tool for you. It's a free 10-minute workshop. It's a free 10-minute video, no sales pitch or anything like that, just actionable advice you can take into your next project with the client and get those zero revisions. Speaking of which, this designer that came into my inbox is a Sprucer Studio alumni, my signature course that I have. And this project was a zero revision project with a little bit of a client sticky situation curveball thrown in there that we'll dig into in a little bit. So when it comes to working with logo designs, you are likely either going to be the designer who creates a fully custom lettered or logo type design, meaning you handcraft every single letter form that's within that logo. Or maybe you're a designer who takes a font and maybe you customize parts of that font for the client. Either way is okay in my book, and designers have different opinions about this. But if you are the second type of designer who is going to be using a font either as a base or as the full logo type for a client, that you need to be pay particular attention to the font licensing. So every time you purchase a font, there is a certain type of license that comes along with it. You can purchase for print, for example. A lot of times it's based on how many computers you're purchasing it for. So 1 computer is 1 license, 5 computers, 5 licenses, and so on. But then within there's finer detail. So if you're using the font on a website, for instance, then likely that license will restrict it based off of page views for that website. So a website that has a high volume of page views is going to pay more for that font versus a website with low volume of page views pays less. Now, when it comes to logo designs, I find that this is pretty variable, especially lately with font licensing. Sometimes it's hard to read those licenses, so it's best to reach out to those wherever you're purchasing the font to get clarity on that if you're not sure. But be sure to check those licenses if you are using them for logo design. A lot of times that it's okay to do that, use a font for a logo designs, but some fonts will restrict that and have different kind of boundaries or maybe an increased price if you are using it for a logo. And the reason is because you're basically outlining the logo, meaning you're flattening it so it's not an actual font anymore, and you're delivering that to your client to use widespread on all of their materials. Essentially using the font that you purchased maybe just for your own computer, one copy, one license for the font, and then it's getting redistributed in its logo form through several materials. And so the typeface designers like to protect themselves from that. And some of them are okay with you using it for logos and use plain English to tell you that. Others kind of hide that language a little bit. And then some are a lot more restrictive. So as a designer, it's really important to look into those things as you are designing a brand for a client. And then also make sure you have ethics and integrity in your work and that you are purchasing the correct number of licenses and such for you, and if you are purchasing for your client as well. What I like to do is just make sure that our branding package is enough that it compensates for the need to purchase fonts. That's just something, we have pretty low overhead as designers, meaning I don't have like a retail store or a lot of physical products, anything like that, shipping costs, things like that. But fonts is one of our main purchases that we have along with software like Adobe. And so I just kind of make sure that I'm covered in the cost of our branding package to purchase new fonts for every client if that's the way we go. Sometimes we don't end up doing that, and that's okay as well. So I love that this designer reached out to me because it shows she has integrity in her work. And even though we'll get into the issue in just a little bit, the situation, even though things kind of went awry a little bit, she's really mindful of purchasing correct licenses for fonts and appreciating those type designers. The people who create the fonts for us, the type designers, do incredible work, and it's really tedious and meticulous if done well and correctly. And they often are pretty low budget for what you use them for fonts. And so I like to make sure that they're being paid appropriately. So make sure you're not sending font files to friends or things like that, just as you would digital downloads, and make sure that those designers are being compensated for that. So let's get into what that looks like for font licensing for a logo type. Again, make sure you look into the license details. Each font will have its own license attached to it. Ideally, you would look into this ahead of time before using the font for a logo. But here's the sticky situation we ran into. This designer used our Zero Vision presentation method. She's a Spruce Your Studio alumni, and she got 0 revisions with this client, which is fantastic. Hey, it works. So maybe go to sprucerd.com/zero, ZERO, and you can snag that method if you want. But this is proof that it does work. I worked with her client. Now here's the hang up. She did look into the cost of the font ahead of time and saw that it was pretty affordable, all under $100 for the entire font family. But what she didn't look into was the specifics when it came to the logo design. After the client had approved the proof, she looked into it and found that it would be pretty costly to actually use this font for a logo design. I won't get into the nitty-gritty of what the license said, but essentially I think it was like $50 or $100 per employee of that company, something like that, some sort of restriction. She reached out to the font designer to see what she could do about it and what license they recommend. All in all, it would end up being about $500, and she did not budget for this, and it's a surprise to her. So what should she do? The client had already approved the proof, and so she reached out to me to see what I would recommend to do. And I asked if I could answer this question publicly, and she said, of course. So here we are. And here's what I would do, and it's the honest truth. I don't think it's what people want to hear, is that I would actually just eat that cost myself and move along with the project. I probably wouldn't even tell the client that, or maybe I would, since they have a restriction on the employees. I wonder how that works. Maybe they would have to purchase new licenses if they grow to, like, say, a company of 100 or something like that. So I might mention that to the client. But what I would do is I would eat that cost and just let the client know, hey, I did not look into this ahead of time. I'm going to be paying for this for you because that's my oops. I did not know. And it's a very unique font. So it's not like she could find something that's really, really similar. It looks really customized for her client and works beautifully with the letter form. She sent me the design. And so it would be hard to replace that. And so what I would do is I would just eat the cost, let the client know that if she grows in the future, that it is going to be an additional license or whatever the terms are. And if that's the case, maybe clarify with the font designer that that's the case. As they grow, they need to purchase more. That's what I would do. If there aren't restrictions as they grow, like maybe she's able to just buy the font now for what it is, for whatever the company size is now. If that's the case, then I wouldn't tell the client. I wouldn't inform them of the surprise cost you have or anything like that if there's nothing they need to do on their end moving forward. And here's why I would do that. First of all, no one likes to be nickel and dimed because even though it's an unexpected cost, it can kind of feel, obviously it would feel bad for the client to have a surprise bill at the end of it when they thought they were paying for the design and they were done with it. That even splitting the cost 50-50 or something like that, the most understanding of clients will still feel a bit nickel and dimed, meaning it's a surprise cost added to that invoice. It just doesn't feel good. For instance, if you go to like a car mechanic and they tell you it's going to be one price, they're notorious for this. And then you go to pick it up and then they add some extra things. It just doesn't feel great. And likely, what are you going to do in that situation? Would you go back to that car mechanic, or would you try to find someone else with a little bit more transparent pricing, even if it is a little bit more? I personally would go elsewhere for that, just because I don't like that kind of relationship where there's surprise add-ons to our invoice. And so you want to be considerate of the longevity of the client. This seems like a fantastic client that approved from the very first proof with no revisions. And so I would be protective of the longevity of the client. And even though $500 is a lot that you don't want to pay all of a sudden unexpectedly, I would think about if this client potentially could give you more repeat work or something like that. That would make up for it. Those are really the main things that I would consider. The alternative is that you could create a new proof, a new design, using maybe somewhat similar of a font, but maybe not as customized. And I have a little bit of hesitancy about this, likely as does this designer who presented this to me, because you already have approval on that design and you don't want your client to have a new one and just be longing for that first one that they already approved. Secondly, that's going to be more time that you are creating a brand new design, and you have to weigh the cost benefit there. If it's worth the $500 to just pay for that logo, or if you are willing to go through potentially another 2 or so rounds of revisions with a new layout of the logo type for the client. So that's kind of where I fall. I would recommend first of all, action steps. I would recommend reaching out to the person that you already were in communication with about the font license and just double check. As their team grows, do they need to reach back out and purchase new licenses, just so you know how to inform your client if that's the case. And if they say no, then I wouldn't even mention it to your client. If they say yes, then that's when I would mention it to your client, to just let them know, or let you know whenever they add new employees, if they go over however much, 20 employees, 15 employees, that they will need to be adding more to it. But otherwise, that's how I would go about it. All in all, try to create a friction-free process. This is a client sticky situation. This designer owned it, that it was on her, that she didn't mean to do this. But sometimes these kind of situations fall into our lap and we don't know how to navigate it. If you can be proactive, if you're watching this and hopefully you're not in this situation, but if you're being proactive, look into licenses ahead of time and make sure that it's okay to use for logos. A lot of times it is okay to use for logos, and they heavily restrict website app views, things like that, as well as desktop licenses, and less on logos. But I'm seeing more and more fonts are putting those lines into their licenses. And so it's not unanimous, or uniform, I should say, across all of the different font licenses. And each typeface comes from a lot of different type designers that have different kind of insights on this type of licensing restrictions. So look into that ahead of time if possible. But overall, if you run into a situation where something is on your end that you messed up, I certainly went through this a few weeks ago actually with a client. I end up eating the cost. Usually that's what I try to do, rather than try to put that on my client to accommodate for that. I've done quote free design days, or design day, I should say, to accommodate for a mix-up confusion in the past, just with hopes of remedying the situation, ending on a positive note, and then also just being able to move forward with that client with future repeat work. It's not a good feeling, but it's what I would recommend doing. So hopefully this was helpful and gains clarity on how to include font licensing as you're creating logo types with your clients. If you haven't already, head to sprucerd.com/0 to snag our zero revision presentation method. You can get zero revisions just like this designer did, and hopefully sans the font licensing drama. All right, thank you so much.